Disclaimer: the views expressed on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. The content of the conversation is not reflective of the institutions or establishments mentioned therein. Take all these opinions with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime if needed. Namaskara, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening, and welcome to this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. My guest this week is, well, just myself. Bad joke. I guess I'm not that good at jokes. But anyway, in this episode, I'm going to be answering some questions that the guests have had for me. The guests from the past sequence of episodes, that is, from episode 16 onwards. So I'm just going to be answering some of those questions in this episode and playing a round of Bish, Bash, Bosh, which is slightly unique this time around in comparison to the last solo episode that I did. But I'll get to that once we get to that point. Get to that. Anyway, I tend to talk to myself quite a bit. So if you do notice that, my apologies. But anyway, without further ado, let's get started. So the first question comes from Shivam Patel, who was the guest on episode 16. And his question goes this way. How do the conversations I have with people, I being me, affect my personal belief? Why behind the podcast? And how has moving here changed me? I could probably structure the reading of that question a little better, but I'll keep that in mind for the next questions that I have. Anyway, to answer the question, having these conversations, I guess just is an attestation to the fact that we all have stories to share and that we all don't necessarily believe in the same things. For example, this is probably me beating a dead horse at this point, but you all know that the reason why I started this podcast was to sort of gain a wider range of perspectives and sort of seek a sense of relatability through the stories that people share and the connections that we have and the overall ultimate goals that we have in life, some of which include wanting to be happy, seeking peace, and so on. So the conversations that I've had so far have just been a practical way of sort of explaining that belief that I had coming in as I started this podcast. And I guess that also answers the second question associated with the section behind the why of this podcast. And it's just a way for me to sort of gain perspective and, try something new. Which I guess is going pretty well so far in terms of my sort of dedication to the goal I'd set for myself. I did set a goal of making 52 episodes, that being an episode a week. And we're on episode 32, which is past the halfway mark. So I'm glad that, I've been able to do it for so far. And I'm hopeful that I can continue doing this in the near future. Excuse me. To answer the third question, which was how has moving here to the United States and Oklahoma changed me? I guess it's changed me in the fact that I've gone a little more inward. Now, to be perfectly honest, I think we all hear voices in our head. There's always a voice chirping at us, telling us things to do, not to do, etc., etc. But I think ever since I've moved here, and it's probably safe to say that probably in the past 2 years, this has sort of magnified itself a little more in that, I've been able to sort of notice my thoughts a little better and, just grow as a person. I mean, we're constantly growing, but I do personally believe that moving here has definitely been a part of this long journey of life that has helped me grow in a lot of ways. So it's definitely changed me in that sense, in terms of going a lot more inward. And I'm not all the way there yet. There's still a lot to do, but it's definitely opened me up to that. So thank you so much for that question, Shivam. Moving on to the next question, and that is from Shahrose Chogle, who is one of my childhood friends. And we had a two-part episode for this two-part podcast rather for this episode, or for this recording that we had. Geez, words. Oh well, we're gonna keep trucking along anyway. So Shahrose's question is, where do I see myself in 10 years' time in terms of what I can or what I will achieve? And where do I want to see myself in the next 10 years in terms of what will I do to make sure that it happens at any cost? So to answer the first question, I would say that I at least hope to be in a position where I'm healthy and happy. Because at the end of the day, if it's neither of those two things, well, at least health mainly, because I am a believer in happiness being a mindset, and it's not always possible to be happy. But yeah, in terms of my health, I guess I would love to be in good health in that time as well, because without health, there's not much you can do, right? You won't have the motivation to get up and do something, or the sort of will to do something if you're feeling sick or are not necessarily doing as well mentally either. So in the next 10 years, I will definitely ensure, and this is probably partly an answer to the second question as well, to sort of make sure that I keep good health of myself and grow mentally and spiritually. To sort of speak from the more material sense, I'd like to see myself in 10 years with at least some semblance of balance. Now, I know that's, something that we figure out as people as we go along, but I'd love to be in a sense of balance, and hopefully this podcast is a decent thing by then and is making me some money, if not a lot, but yeah, I'd say that's probably another goal that I have for myself, is with this sort of passion project that I've started since January. So I'm hopeful that I can, still continue to do this in the next 10 years, and will do my damnedest to sort of continue doing this. In terms of what I will make sure happens at any cost, again, from a more material sense, at least be in a situation where I can give back to my parents enough. I say that in the sense that they're growing old, and I mean, they're not that old. They look pretty young, and I'll pop up a recent picture over here of them. But yeah, I think they're pretty healthy, knock on wood. But I would love to be able to support them and not have them work to feed themselves in the next 10 years. I mean, the earlier the better, but I'd definitely love to see myself in that position where I can support them in the next 10 years. So that's probably the two major motives that I have for myself. Other than that, I haven't necessarily given it too much thought. Again, from a more materialistic sense in terms of what I want. And I don't mean to say the word materialistic in a negative way at all, because it's part of life after all. Like, we need these material things to be able to survive in the world. So yeah, I don't necessarily have anything specific in terms of what I want, be it like a car or a house or anything like that. Nothing at the moment of that sort. So I hope that answers your question, Shahrose, and I apologize if this is a bit of a cop-out. But anyway, moving on to the next question, and this is from Yana Son, and her question was, how do you become an active listener, and how important do you think it is? Can it possibly harm you, or is it always a good thing? That's an interesting question, and I think you become an active listener by listening, right? I mean, it's easy to put it that way. But I personally think that you need to be paying attention while you're sort of listening. And the reason I say that is because it's very easy for our thoughts to wander. Even when I'm talking to the camera right now, it's very easy for my thoughts to wander into a different zone now that I've brought up many different topics in the first few questions that I've answered so far. So even when you're listening, your thoughts tend to wander, and that's just sort of part of human nature in a lot of ways. And it maybe doesn't help. Or the fact that we have a lot of stimuli in this current generation, if you will, probably doesn't help as much either. But yeah, I would say that you need to pay attention to make sure that you're actively listening to what the person is saying. And I think it's something that you develop with practice. It's not something that's going to happen the first time you do it, but I'm certain that if you sort of pay attention and sort of listen closely to what the person is saying, you can definitely be an active listener. And it's definitely important because it's very easy to sort of forget that at points in our lives when we're having conversations with our loved ones, they're not necessarily having a conversation to sort of, they're not necessarily wanting to have a two-way conversation. I guess that's a better way of putting it. They're wanting to sort of dump out everything that they have, and maybe you could jump in when they sort of need you, but it's not like a continuous flow of a two-way conversation. And I think it's important in those places because sometimes they're probably answering the questions that you have about what they're saying. And I mean, this is just one example to sort of say how important it is, but there's a ton of examples in terms of why or how it can certainly help. Because even for me, from a podcasting sense, it definitely helps me guide the conversation. When I pay attention to what the person is saying, and if there's something that sort of sparks or something or triggers something in my head, I'm like, oh, okay, I find that interesting. I'm gonna sort of push that button a little further and sort of find out what the sort of deeper meaning under that response to my question was. So yeah, it definitely helps, and it's definitely important. And the next question, or sub-question if you will, is asking if it can possibly harm you. And yes, I think it can if you are creating a narrative based off of what the person is saying. Now, sure, we all create narratives. I mean, that's what we do. That's what our brain does, to be perfectly honest. I mean, that's just my opinion. But yeah, we're constantly creating narratives, creating opinions about things that we see in the external world and so on. So I think it can harm you when you pay attention and listen to what a person is saying, which is a great thing. But if you are sort of trying to create a storyline out of it, and sort of overthinking on that story, I guess that's where it sort of becomes a bit of a problem. Because I'm not going to take any names or any people, but I do know a person, a family member rather, who, she tends to pay attention to everything that's happening around her. She tends to listen, but then once that's done, she sort of internalizes everything, and she sort of tends to just overthink about the things that she's listening to. So it definitely can harm you in that sense. So I would say the act of actively listening is not harmful directly, but the outcome of it can be. So yeah, that's just my take on it, and I hope that answers the question. The next question comes from Jonathan Williams, and his question was, how important is your faith to you, and how do you work towards making it stronger every day? I am a religious person, and faith is definitely something that's important to me. I am a believer in God and the universe, if you will. And how do I make it stronger every day? Is probably the best answer to that would be meditation, because I actively make sure that I'm grateful to God and to the universe for everything that I have in my life at this point. Is there more I want to achieve? 100%. But I think that sort of act of being grateful in my meditations, or just grateful in general, for the simplest of things, like the clothes I'm wearing, or the roof that I'm under, or the food that I eat. I think those things definitely help sort of strengthen your belief in faith and in providence, which is a word that I was first introduced to from this podcast episode featuring Ranveer Alabadia, who was mentioned in the previous episode of this sort of Q&A thing that I do. So it was with him and another person that I follow called Luke Coutinho, and I will tag that episode on the bottom if you're sort of interested to sort of check it out. But yeah, I would say like sort of understanding the importance of faith, or maybe the connection that I have with the external universe, and how it sort of helps me internally and externally in my own bubble, if you will. I think understanding that is very important, and being grateful for everything that you have, and like sort of internalizing that during my meditations has definitely been a way for me to strengthen that on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, that's pretty much it, I guess. In terms of prayer and meditation, that sort of definitely helps strengthen my belief. And of course, there's always ups and downs. There's always days when you tend to wonder what's happening, and you tend to overthink about the outcomes of certain actions and so on. But having that faith has probably kept me going in a lot of ways. So yeah. The next question is from Evonne Wong, and she has two questions. And the first one is, what do you hope to get and learn out of these podcasts, and is there a direction that I'm striving for? Well, I've kind of answered this in the first question, but to just add a little more depth to it, eventually I do hope to have at least some impact. At the end of the day, I have no control over how someone watching this or someone listening this takes it in. But if it can make a difference in somebody's life, or in the smallest of sense. So say, for example, they're listening to me blabber on about faith and about God, and they're probably someone that doesn't necessarily believe in God. But my explanation of being grateful and being sort of meditative about it, if it sparks a thought in them about, hey, okay, fair, I maybe don't believe in God, but there probably might be something to what this person is saying. Now, they don't necessarily have to agree with what I'm saying, but they can if they come to a position where they can accept it for what it is. And if these podcasts and everything else that I do with the Instagram page or with Twitter can sort of help that, that's probably mission accomplished in a lot of ways. Because it's very easy to sort of, and especially in this world today, it's very easy to sort of stay in your soapbox and sort of assume that your bubble is the bubble. So sort of coming to an understanding that there's a lot around us and we never really know the full story to something that we see, or the multiple sides associated with it. Coming to an understanding about all those things is definitely something that I'd like to trigger through these podcasts and everything else that I do. But then again, it's not something that's in my control. It's something that's in the other person's control. So I'm not gonna beat myself up about it. But if it does happen, great. I'd be forever grateful for that. In terms of a direction, well, yeah, I mean, I guess I've kind of answered this already too, but to sort of dig deeper into that a little more, I'd like to be in a position where I can still do this and talk to some people whom I have listed in my journal. I'm probably going to mention a few names in one of the questions below, because there is a question that asks about that. But yeah, I definitely would love to be in a position where I could speak to some people that I admire and some people who made me think about wanting to do this, and wanting to sort of share those stories and sort of fuel those curiosities within me. So I'd definitely love to be in a position where I can still be curious about everything that's happening around the world and sort of get to talk to the people that I admire. So yeah, that's definitely a direction, if you will. For the second question, on top of the first question, what was the most interesting topic, story that you've talked about with your guests? What struck me the most and kept me thinking about it even later? A part of me is a little diplomatic, so it's probably going to be hard for me to sort of pick one out, but I can definitely pick one out though if I give it a little more thought. And I think there's many topics, it's not just one or two, because every episode helps me sort of trigger my inner curiosities. So for example, when I'm listening to someone saying something, if that pops up a question in my mind, I sort of try to ask that question and sort of direct the conversation in that direction. So, I do tend to listen to something new or listen to something that I find fascinating in every episode. That's the diplomatic side. But if I was to be a little more specific, I would say, excuse me, I'm on an empty stomach, so I apologize if I'm constantly burping. But what strikes me the most and what kept me thinking about it more than ever? Well, I guess I would say that we spoke about vulnerability on episode 15 with Shichi, and I think that was sort of like an interesting topic to think about even after the episode. And be it episode 14 with Lisbeth, I think in that episode too we sort of spoke about family and the things that we learned from them. So that's definitely something that sort of makes you think about your priorities in an overall sense. Sense is what I said, if the mic didn't catch that. But yeah. Other than that, well, there is an episode that we have recorded which hasn't come out yet, where I sort of dug into some other curiosities of mine. So I'm not going to really hint on that as much. But other than saying that it was related to geopolitics, which sort of tends to fascinate me. And yeah, that was an interesting story and sort of conversation to have. But be on the lookout for that. That episode will probably come out in a couple of weeks' time. So there is that. I hope that I answered your question, Evonne, and did justice to it. But thank you for sending that in. The next question comes in from Andin, and she asks, if you could choose how your life would go down before you were born, would you do it? And how would you choose your life to be? Okay, that's quite a deep one in the sense that you don't choose where you're born, right? You're sort of just picked up from one space and sort of dropped. And yeah, you don't necessarily choose where you're born. So being able to choose, it's hard. it's a hard one to think about. And I didn't necessarily want to prepare for any of these questions and wanted to keep them natural so that... Oh, there's my timer for my laundry. I will be right back. And I'm back. To go back to the question, I guess if I could choose... I'm going to manipulate this question slightly. If I could choose the world that I was born into, I would probably choose to be born in a world that wasn't as polarized and wasn't as divided. I mean, sure, if you want to look at it in one sense, media probably amplifies it more than it actually is, but it still exists, and it might just be a vocal minority, but it's still a vocal one. So if I could be born into a world that was less polarized, I would probably have loved that. And I guess to sort of be a critique of my own answer, there's always going to be polars, there's always going to be two sides or more, so it's not easy to sort of believe, or well, I guess believe is the wrong word, but I don't think it's possible rather to live in a world where everything is just one thing. Then I guess we'd be going back to the antithesis, if I said that correctly, or to the total opposite of what I'd want, in the sense of being uniqueness, or having uniqueness rather, and that connection and conversation with people from different sort of walks of life. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one to say the least, but I guess a better way of putting it would be to say that I'd prefer to have been born in a world where we didn't vilify people for their beliefs, and that we accepted them for what they were and took them at face value, even if we didn't necessarily agree with them. That's definitely a world I'd love to have been born in. And I'd also love to have been born in a world just to sort of add to that a little more. That is a little more in tune with the internal self. And sure, it's something that we all learn over a period of time, but I definitely would love to have lived or been born in a world that was much more internally aware of their sort of workings, and a world that was a little more spiritually connected. Would I do it? Was one of the other questions. I'm sorry, I just sort of I was just reading through the question again and it sort of just spat out at me. And for podcast listeners, I am doing some hand actions, so that's probably why you heard a bit of a clap. But yeah, would I do it? Well, what I described would probably be a bit of an ideal world, and in that case, I probably wouldn't do it, because it takes away the charm that this sort of imperfectness that this world has. And yeah, that imperfectness would be lost in an ideal world that I just described, that I would have loved to have been born in. Yeah, I probably wouldn't do it, because this world, as much as it has its flaws, it has given me a lot. And if I was to look at it from a perspective of religion and spirituality, this is where I'm meant to be at this point in time. So this is a journey that I will take. And so to answer the second part of the question, no, I wouldn't choose to live in the ideal world that I just created for myself. But I hope I answered that question. Thank you so much, Ann, for sending that in. The next question comes from Rodger Allen, and his question was, when did you decide to make the podcast, and how has it affected you? I've probably explained this before, but I had the internal thought of wanting to do it back in June or July of 2020. This was sort of in like the peak pandemic, if you will. Was it the peak? I guess it was probably a little after the peak, but things were still not the same as it was before. It was around June or July of last time when I thought about doing it, and I made up my mind, I believe sometime around September or October, because that's when I put in the money to purchase this guy right here, and I'm pointing to my mic for those of you listening to this episode. So I guess the decision to sort of go ahead and buy a mic was probably the sort of deciding factor in me sort of going gung-ho and wanting to do it, because I did take some classes on Skillshare about like podcasting and just to sort of see what I made of it in terms of its process and everything associated with it. But I don't think I've made up my mind or finalized it until I actually went ahead and purchased a mic. So I guess that was probably the moment where I made up my mind that I would do it. And how has it affected me? To answer the second part of the question, I will try not to sound like a broken record, so I'm going to think of something else that I can add to it. I think that phase of June, July, August 2020 brought in a sense of awareness I probably did not have before. I personally do believe that I was quite an aware person, but I think it went up a notch around that time, that I was mostly kept to myself with my thoughts because we weren't necessarily going out and sort of mingling with the outside world at that point in time. So I would say that it's definitely made me a lot more aware. And this is not the podcast specifically, but everything that came with it. Because that's when I got into the habit of meditation and sort of thinking about the openness that I could have towards the world and towards its philosophies and stories and etc. etc. So I would say that it's definitely made me a lot more aware of sort of even the narrative patterns and sort of understanding. I mean, you can never truly understand, but you can sort of draw a picture to sort of connect the dots. So I think all of those things have definitely changed me for the better ever since I started thinking about doing the podcast and starting Random Relatability as a venture of its own. Thank you for that question, Rodger. Moving on to the next question from Kruti Chaliawala. And she asks, if I ever had a chance to interview any person from history, who would it be and why? History wasn't necessarily my most favorite subject in school, but I did find it fascinating thinking about it. Thinking about it as I've grown older. I would say, okay, now I have an interesting thought that sort of came up, which is kind of associated to the conversation that we had, Kruti and I, that is, had on that episode about sex education and how the invasion by the British and the sort of conservatism that they brought in with them affected the Indian population. So maybe I would love to go back and talk to not a specific person, but the group of people that were first impacted by the British invading India, to sort of get a perspective for why they chose to do what they do. And sure, I mean, there's explanations of it in history of money and the British taking advantage of, like, sort of, as they would call it rather, illiteral nature of the population back then, and so on. Yeah, so I would love to talk to that group of people who were initially, and maybe I could do like a search about this down the road and sort of figure it out in terms of who were the people who were initially affected, because my history memory is not helping me out with this. But yeah, to sort of twist the question a little, and I apologize, I'm taking liberties with these questions and sort of spinning them in different ways, but I didn't want to give a cliche answer. So yeah, definitely would say that I'd love to talk to the group of people that were initially affected by the East India Company and everything that happened with it, to sort of gain a perspective of their sort of outlook on life before and life after, and what they thought would have possibly happened to India down the road, like after the 250 or 300 odd years. Like, I apologize, I can't remember the specific numbers. Thank you for understanding, because like I said, my history knowledge is not up to the mark. But yeah, I would say that it would be fascinating to get to talk to them. And I will stop repeating myself and move on to the next question. But thank you so much for sending that in, Kruti. I really appreciate it. The next question comes from Dr. Hill, Dr. Desiree Hill. And she asks me to choose an item that is important to me and show it on camera and explain why it's one of the more significant items or possessions in my life. I would say that you're probably looking at it right now, and it's this thing right here. For audio listeners, I'm pointing at my mic again. And the reason I say that is because it probably is the most important possession at the moment in my life. And maybe, sure, I'm probably going to move on to a different mic for better quality and so on. But at this moment in time, I would say that this is probably a thing that I would attach myself to as being important, because it made me believe and made me take a step that I probably wouldn't have taken if I was to think, or overthink rather, of the outcome of doing this. Because it's very easy to... Jeez, I feel like I'm getting a little emotional. Yeah, I felt my eyes feeling a little heavy. But anyway, because I think, sort of like I answered this question earlier about the mic rather, or about that sort of inflection point or turning point, getting the mic at least made me believe that I could do this thing, and the mindset that came with it was to do it irrespective of what the outcome would be. Because it's very easy to sort of get demotivated by seeing the number of Instagram followers sort of reducing, or not necessarily going up, or seeing your own Twitter following going up to, let's say, 140 followers, to then dropping down to 135. I've not purely detached myself from those numbers, but they haven't affected me as much either, and I've kept myself going. And yeah, I would say that it's probably all because of having this mic in front of me. It's given me the opportunity to speak to a lot of people, Dr. Hill, you included, because I had names on my journal of the list of people that I would have loved to have talked to, and sort of dig up this internal curiosity that I had. So I would definitely say that the mic that I own at the moment was probably that, or is probably the possession that I have with me right now. That probably means a lot to me and means a lot to this journey that I've chosen to take. Because again, I don't know where all this is gonna go. I'm no fortune teller, but whenever I listen to people talk about nuance or sort of understanding different sides of the story, or sort of listening to the different sides, it does sort of trigger something in my head or in my mind, which makes me think that I'm doing something that's valuable. And my mic helps me do that. It helps me do something that, if I didn't go ahead and buy this, and if I was afraid of the outcome of doing all of this, I probably wouldn't have developed that internal strength, if you will, to sort of not be bogged down by the numbers, and also get to talk to the people that I wanted to talk to about the things that I wanted to talk about. So yeah, definitely I don't know why I feel a bit tongue-tied as I'm talking about this, but well, I think I do know why, but because it means something to me. It is quite important to me. So yeah, I guess that'd be a good place to stop there. It'd be a good place to stop before I get a little too emotional. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, Dr. Hill. Thank you so much for sending that in. The next question comes from Andrew, who is a friend that I made on Twitter, and I'm glad that I've become friends with him. And his question was, he actually sent in a couple, and his first question was, if you have a dream guest list of people you'd want on your podcast, who would be in your top 10, and tag them all on Twitter. Since he's asked me to tag them all on Twitter, what I'm gonna do is direct you all to my Twitter page. By the time that you are watching this episode, this tweet will have probably gone out, and I'll have to make sure that I do that, and I should probably set a reminder for this. But yeah, go follow me on Shetty Prateek. I'll probably put that up on the screen, and I'll also attach it in the description down below for audio listeners, so that you can click the link and sort of check out my answer to this question. So I'm going to tag them on Twitter, and you can get to see the people that I want to talk to, or the people that I admire and would love to get sort of a slice of their life. But his second question was, what would your parents say if you told them that you'd want to be a full-time professional podcaster? Well, first of all, I need to say thank you to everybody for sending in such deep questions. It really makes you think about the things that you prioritize in life, and the things that you hold near and dear to yourself. So what would my parents say? Well, I think at the end of the day, they would want me to be in a position where I'm happy and I'm not stressing out about the fact that I'm doing something that I don't love. So if I did end up doing this full time, they would probably be okay with it. I mean, and of course, like, like I said earlier, we are in a materialistic world and those things are important to us. So I would have to probably back it up with a sense of showing that I can still lead a stable life with taking this path, because the other part of my life, which is my chemistry degree and my forensic science degree, is more of a conventional way of sort of making money, and nothing against that, because there are people making a living and there are people serving the public through those roles. So nothing wrong with that at all. But yeah, if I was to become a full-time podcaster, my parents, it might, well, this is me thinking about what they would say, so I'm probably not going to be accurate, but I would think that it initially might be a bit of a tough pill to swallow. But like I said, as long as it makes me happy and I'm leading a life that they can see I'm not struggling to get by. I mean, there's struggles in everyday life, but like, I think every parent wants this for their children, and that they want to see their children in a good place where they're happy with good health and not having to struggle for their next meal or for the roof that they're living under. So yeah, I'd say that as long as I'm happy and living a decent life, I think they'd eventually turn around and sort of accept it and be okay with me choosing this path. So yeah, initially they probably might question the choice, because it's not something that, while there's a lot of content creators on the rise, it's not a conventional career. And this is nothing against people of that generation, but our parents' generation came in with a more conventional mindset of making money. And once you sort of break out of that, because content creation, while you do see a lot of content creators on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and so on and so forth, if you were to sort of evaluate that from the 7.6 billion or whatever the number is of the living population, it's not as many people still. So there's always going to be that question mark of, is this going to be a stable way of living life? Is this going to make him enough money to where he can pay his bills and eat and have a roof to stay under and have some clothes to wear? So I guess their first sort of thought would be that. Yeah. I think I've been going in circles with all of these answers, and if I have been, I really apologize. But I hope I've answered your question, Andrew. And I will tag you in that tweet that you've asked me to share. So I will tag them all on Twitter, and if you want to see what my answer is, then head on over and check out my page on Twitter. But the next question comes from Ram, and his question was, what is your favorite childhood memory and how has that impacted you in your journey in the United States? Well, my favorite childhood memory would be ignore me. What would my favorite childhood memory be? I apologize for the dead air over there, but I think again, like I've flipped a few of these questions, I'm probably going to slightly flip this one to say my childhood memory of moving away from my parents and living with my grandmother in India. Because for those of you who don't know, I was born in the United Arab Emirates in 1998. And I lived there for about 12 years before I moved to India to stay with my grandmother. I would say my memory of my time there in India had its ups and downs. And again, this is nothing against my grandmother. I love her to death. But we had our differences in opinions. We had our differences in the way that we thought about things and the way that we did things. And I think it didn't help that at that point in time, we both were overthinkers. I know that more of her after living with her, but I know that of myself after I've sort of analyzed the past few years of my life. But I think the fact that we were both overthinkers did not necessarily help. But moving to India and staying with her and sort of having that experience, which overall was beautiful. Because I was able to stay there with my grandmother, I was sort of independent in a sense that I didn't necessarily rely on my parents for help with a lot of things. In the sense of an emotional connection, if you will. I was lucky enough to have some really close relatives around me who also sort of helped me in that journey of transitioning and sort of staying in India and living there for 6 odd years. So I would say that my memory of that is something that I'll probably hold dear to me as I grow into an adult, because that phase of life gave my parents belief to send me here. Because when I brought it up to them, the idea of moving abroad and studying forensic science, it didn't necessarily take them as long to think about it. They were willing to sort of jump on the bandwagon and send me here. And I think the fact that, and my parents have mentioned this to me, and the fact that I've lived by myself to an extent. Of course, I had my grandmother helping me out and cooking for me and all that. But my time there sort of helped them see that I could live with myself. And at the age of 18, when I moved here, they had that belief that I'd be okay. So yeah, I would say that memory of living there has definitely impacted my journey over here in the United States and how I've sort of lived it and taken it day by day. Now, have I done everything right? Most definitely not. But it is definitely, my time in India created a segue for this amazing journey that I've had, which probably wouldn't have happened if I didn't move here. And if I hadn't moved to India from the United Arab Emirates, this wouldn't have happened. You wouldn't be seeing me in front of this screen, or on your screen rather. And probably all of this also goes back to my personal belief of everything happening for a reason. So I would say that that's a memory that I will think of a lot in terms of where it's brought me today and how it's impacted my journey of living in the United States. Yep. But that's an awesome question. Moving on to another awesome question. And this one comes from Nasir Malik. And he asks, are we living in a simulation? This one's a spicy one. And I say that mainly because I don't think that there's a lot of people that think about this necessarily. But it is something that does float around some people's minds about our sort of way of life and everything that's happening, so on and so forth. So, are we living in a simulation? I don't know the answer to this question from the knowledge that I have, which is to say that what I'm going to say next is not something that I've sat with and thought about, but it's something that I've heard from an external source, and that's sort of making me think that it's possibly true that we're living in a simulation. And this goes back to the Joe Rogan experience, which I've probably again rattled on about on Instagram, Twitter, and maybe even the podcast. He was speaking to two comedians, one of them was a comedian, Andrew Schultz, and the other one was Charlemagne, the god. There we go. Both comedians, and Charlemagne is also a radio host. And I will tag this episode down below as well. But they were talking about the world being a simulation, and Joe Rogan mentioned a physicist. It might have been Brian Cox, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm not quite sure. But it might have been a physicist or somebody that he was talking to, and apparently they told him this sort of anecdote, or not anecdote rather, but they told him about this possibility. There we go. I guess I have been at a struggle for words in this episode. But yeah, to sort of answer that question, I would say, to go back to what I was talking about actually. He was told that if a newly born child and the mother were given a watch at the same time, at the same moment, with the clock set at the same time, let's say 8 a.m. in the morning, right? Both of the watches were set at the same time and were given one to the mother and one to the child. After a long period of time, let's say 20 odd years or something like that, assuming that the watch was working to its best condition over that period of time, the times on those watches would be different. So say, for example, on the mother's watch, you would probably read 8:05 a.m., whereas on the son's watch, you might probably read 8 a.m. So all this to say that time is different for each individual in the way that we experience it, in the way that we are a part of it, and a way in which that it's part of our journey. It's a very trippy concept, but him sort of saying that made me think about the possibility of all this being like an individual simulation. Like my world is a simulation of its own in comparison to your world, and which might be a simulation of its own. So again, this is not from the knowledge that I have or anything that I've sought out or sort of sat and pondered about, but just thinking about that and sort of how the nature of life is very cyclical makes me think about the possibilities of the world being a simulation. And the reason why I say that it's cyclical is because of this concept of research and everything like that. Like, for example, say 1,000 years back, like a civilization in India, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, whatever it may be, they had this technique of living life or sort of treating medicine and so on. Fast forward to the present world, through research, which again, I'll tag this episode down below as well, but I'm going to mention the sort of explanation behind it in a moment. The fact that we are researching some of these things makes me think that we are sort of going back and forth with all of this. And as we are growing in a technological sense, because back then they probably didn't have the things that we have at the moment, but we are still looking for the same things. We are still seeking the same things. Yeah, that makes me think that we might possibly be living in a simulation. And this whole concept of research that I was just mentioning came up in an episode of the Ranveer show. Again, going back to Ranveer Alabadia, and a guest he had on the podcast, who is Sarvesh Shashi, who has this wellness and health platform and company called Sarva. But I'm going to link that episode down below as well. And in that episode, he spoke about how research is basically like, if you split it into two words, you are repeating the search of things that have happened in the past. Yeah. So I will tag that episode down below, but all of those things make me think that we're possibly in a simulation. But moving on to the last question from the guests, I do have a couple of questions from Twitter, but this is the last question from a guest that I've had on the podcast, and that is from Desmond. This is probably similar in some way or connected to some way to the previous question. Kinda, maybe kinda not, but well, never mind. I take that back. It's probably not connected. But I'm still going to leave this in there because people can see how, scatterbrain I am. Anyway, his question goes this way. With so much evil and bad things, I had to change the word there because there was a expletive there. But with so much evil and bad things going on in the world, do you think there's still hope for this world to become a better place? Or do you think that nuking the earth would be a better course of plans? Ay. Well. When he sent me this question, I asked him why he chose to send this question, and he said that it was something that he was thinking about. And I understand, we all have different thoughts, and some of them can seem not as wild to you, but wild to somebody else. But this is definitely an interesting question to think about, because if you were to look at the concept of suffering and the manner in which we are currently living in this world, it would be easy for us to end all suffering by nuking the planet. You nuke the planet, everything is sort of kaboom, done. And that's it. Then you let life to regenerate again, and sort of evolution and all that fun stuff happens. So, if you were to look at it from the perspective of suffering, I think nuking the world would make it easy to end the suffering. But excuse me, I'm not quite sure if that is the best approach. I apologize if you can hear some coins. There were a couple of coins from the laundry room. But yeah, in this episode you've probably noticed how scatterbrain I am and how I tend to repeat myself. But I guess it's who I am at this point, and there's some work that I need to do. But anyway, getting back to this concept of suffering, I had read this book sometime last year called A Man's Search for Meaning. It was written by an Austrian doctor who is a survivor in the Holocaust, and his name was Viktor Frankl. And I'm going to mention this book in the bottom, or in the description rather. But that book discusses this concept of suffering and a human being's outlook towards suffering and so on. What I remember from that book was, and again, this is just me probably drawing some parallels, and if I am incorrect about my inferences from the book, and if you've read it, please feel free to openly disagree with me in the comments. But yeah, to go back to answer that question, what I understood from the book was, if you gave up because you were suffering, you would probably end up succumbing to the problems that you were in. But if you had a positive outlook on that suffering, and you had something on the other side of the fence that you wanted to achieve, that you possibly would have achieved after going through that suffering, you're probably more likely to make it out alive. And this was something that he was thinking about and sort of observing in his time in those concentration camps at the time. So all this to say that I think there is hope, as long as people are willing to believe that we can get out of this rut, to put it simply. If we lose belief and hope about the possibility of this world becoming a better place, then that's probably the end game. It's probably just that. And basically, that was a reference to Thanos and the Avengers. But anyway, before I get into a rabbit hole again, I would say that it's possible, as long as we look at suffering as just a way to sort of get to the other side, which will probably be better. And life is not void of suffering, but I think a lot of it also depends on what we make out of it. Yeah. That is how I would put it. There we go. Cool. Well, again, thank you so much to all the guests for sending these questions in. I am going to transition into two questions that I had off Twitter. One I kind of particularly picked out because it was a question in response to my tweet, but I thought it'd be a good thing to sort of discuss about on the podcast. So I picked that out as well. But the first question comes from Deepti Tandon. And again, follow all these people on Instagram on Twitter rather. I'm going to attach their pages on the link, or words. I'm going to link their pages in the description below. Voila. There we go. Anyway, but to go back to the question, Deepti asks, what is the correlation between physical activity and the humility of self-expression? That's another deep one. To look at it this way, physical activity is something that keeps us going, right? It keeps the wheels rolling in this game that we call life. But with our physical activities, we tend to externalize some of our internal motivations. Some of those could be slightly more negative, like wanting to show off the things that you have in life, or wanting to sort of one-up someone, or wanting to do something very random which might affect somebody around you. And there's also a positive side to it. Through your physical activity, you could do good to the world by spreading a word. You could give to those affected. You could help build a school, so on, right? So I think the humility aspect of it comes in when you realize that your physical activity shouldn't necessarily be a vehicle for your greed or your sort of internal ambitions that are negative, so to speak, that might affect those around you. I think the humility in self-expression is understanding that you don't necessarily need to act in a certain way where you'd be showing off or affecting somebody negatively, or building a wall. I don't know why that's the word that came up or why that's the phrase that came up in my mind, but I'm gonna go with it. So it's all of those things that make me think that humility is an understanding that those things don't necessarily need to be a part of our life or need to be a part of our life to keep our life going, because that's probably just taking us away from the trueness of us as human beings and the connection that we share with each other. Because after all, we are social beings and there's nothing that can disprove of that. But we still tend to have some motivations that may negatively impact those around us. So I think humility is an understanding that cut out the BS that you don't need. And it's not something that you're going to realize right away. It's not really possible for you to realize that way or realize it right away, because it's something that you experience over a period of time. Life is like a mixture of experiences that you have. And this is coming from a 23-year-old, so take it with a pinch of salt, if you will. But life is a bag of experiences, and in those experiences lay some lessons. And within those lessons, we understand what to do and what not to do. And through those learnings, I believe we can build that humility of self-expression. But that's really a deep question. And I apologize again if I've been going in circles. But thank you so much Thank you so much for that, Deepti. Moving on to the other question that I picked out from Twitter. And this was the question that I was talking about, which is more of a response to one of my tweets. And it was from Harshit Singh. And his question was, how can we deal with the adversities of the with us or against us mentality? The tweet was mainly about being opinionated and being open-minded at the same time. So to sort of expand on that a little more, and I'll put up the tweet over here in just a moment as I'm talking, but it is very easy for us to forget that it's okay to have opinions, it's okay to strongly believe about something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be close-minded about what other people possibly believe. You can still be open-minded about, someone who follows the Christian faith, or someone who believes in Islam, or someone who doesn't agree with the principle of veganism. It may be anything. We can always be of the opinion that a vegan diet is bad for you, but at the same time understand that it might be bad for you specifically, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad for somebody else, because it might work for somebody else. And I think understanding that is a huge aspect in sort of being open-minded towards the possibilities in this world. So I guess a way of dealing with those adversities is sort of that with us or against us mentality is to understand that we're all still figuring things out and our experiences are unique to us. Just because a vegan diet, I don't know why I'm going back to this vegan diet example, but just because a vegan diet doesn't necessarily work for you doesn't mean that it won't work for somebody else, right? For example, for some people, they prefer to burn the midnight oil, whereas for some people, they prefer to wake up early in the morning. Some people prefer to believe in 1,000 gods. Some people prefer to believe in one figure. And some people prefer to not believe in anything. Some people prefer to believe in this universe being a giver. So there's many different schools of thought that keep this world going. And if we were to think that the way we think is the right way to think, then that's just a naive way of looking at life. Because take it for what you will. The way in which we tackle certain issues that come up towards someone who doesn't necessarily share the same opinions as us has gotten a lot worse in this window of time. So understanding and sort of pulling back and maybe questioning the reasons behind why a person chooses to do the things they do can go a long way in understanding that they have reasons for doing that, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you are wrong, but at the same time it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong either, which is why you can be opinionated. Like I can be opinionated about what Hinduism gives me, but at the same time that doesn't necessarily mean that Hinduism gives the same thing to somebody else, which is why they might choose to believe in a different faith. So yeah, it's sort of like building that separation between the two, because we've created this weird and awkward gumbo out of our personal opinions that we have a strong affiliation towards, and this concept of being open versus closed-minded. So yeah, there we go. I just wanted to add context to that a little more through talking about it rather than just putting it within 280 characters. So yeah, there goes that. But that's it for the questions. Again, thank you so much to everybody for sending those questions in. We are going to move into the segment Bish, Bash, Bosh, where this time I have 6 words that I'm going to respond to in 3 words or in 3 phrases. And again, excuse me for burping. Maybe I should have a sip of water. I've been talking quite a bit. Let's do that. All right. Bish, Bash, Bosh. For those of you who are new around here, Bish, Bash, Bosh is basically a segment on the podcast where I usually tend to ask guests the same 5 words, which is differences, nuances, learning, empathy, and similarities. And I ask for their responses to these words. But in this episode, since it's a solo episode and sort of like a Q&A thing, the last time I did this Q&A podcast, I had words sent in to me from guests, or not guests rather. Well, a few of them were sent by guests, but then there were a few that I'd asked for on Instagram as well. So one of these words I asked, I put up a question box on my stories and I got 1 word in response for it. So out of the 6 words, one of those is that. And for the other 5, I sort of chose to pick out words, like a singular word, from a tweet that I read on, I forget what day it was, but I guess it was the day that I was preparing these questions and putting them together. Which my document tells me was 8 days ago. But anyway, so I picked out a singular word from 5 different tweets and sort of put them in here for me to respond to in 3 words or in 3 phrases. Excuse me. So let's get started. The first word is evil. And this was sent in by Praneet, who is one of my friends, one of my close friends from the 11th grade. Excuse me, from back home in Mangalore. And his word was evil. I guess the 3 things that come to my mind when I say the word evil are bad, nuking, because we mentioned it earlier in one of the questions, and good. Because good is the opposite of evil. But yeah, moving on to the next word, and this was from a tweet, and I will put up these tweets over here and I'll read them as well, so that you all get context to the words that I've chosen. So here goes the first word. The first word that I picked out was underrated, and it comes from Ezekiel L. And the tweet was, I think the ability to adapt well in any situation is really underrated. What do you think? That's the tweet. Now for the word underrated, the 3 things that come to my mind are unseen, cloudy, and noticing. There we go. The next word is from a tweet by George Mack, and his tweet goes this way. It is easy to forget. Weird is better than average. The average person doesn't exist. It's just a blended mean of 7 billion individuals. If you market to them, you market to nobody. So the word that I chose to respond to was average. And the 3 things that come to my mind when I say the word average are median, mean, and statistics. There we go. Alright. The third word comes from a tweet by Sanket, and his tweet goes as follows. Being uncomfortable is often a benefit. So the word that I chose from this tweet was uncomfortable. And the 3 things that come to my mind are seeking discomfort. Yes, theory. I'll link that YouTube channel below as well. The second thing I would say is knowledge, and listening to your thoughts. There we go. Moving on to the fourth word, which comes from a tweet by Adit Seth, and his tweet reads as follows. Do you think fleets are effective? Okay, for those of you who don't know, just to add context, Fleets was this feature on Twitter which was similar to Instagram stories, where people could share people's tweets like in story form and so on. So that's the tweet, and the word that I chose from this tweet was effective. Now, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind when I say the word effective is work. Second thing being possibilities. And the third thing being effort. There we go. The last word for this segment of Bish Bash Bosh comes from a tweet by Armani Talks, and the tweet reads as follows. A story is a string of ideas. How you string the ideas together is completely up to you. But just knowing there is a string involved should make you aware that logic exists in the storytelling world. Logic and creativity aren't enemies. They are actually best friends till the end. Now, the word that I chose from this tweet was story. And to respond to the word story, I'd say narrative, life, and books. There you have it. That's a segment of Bish Bash Bosh. It's been 32 episodes and I guess I still can't say it properly, can I? But anyway, that's another episode of Bish Bash Bosh in the books. Thank you so much for... Well, I'm gonna DM these people and thank you them. Words! Anyway, I'm gonna thank them for their tweets and I'll mention this to them as well. But I want to thank you guys. To all the guests who sent in the questions. To all the people on Twitter who sent me the questions. And to Praneeth. And to the 5 people whose tweets I used for this segment. Thank you to everybody for contributing to this episode. Without you, I probably wouldn't have rambled on for an hour and a half. So thank you. I really appreciate you indirectly or directly being a part of this journey of mine of podcasting and content creation. So thank you so much. Before I ramble on too much, I think I should just call this good. So I don't know why I've been saying something and then going into deep thought. Some of it has to do with this Charisma on Command video that I watched, which again I will link below. And it was about sort of like a breakdown of Sadhguru, whom, if you don't know who that is, I will pop up a picture right here. So yeah, so they did the character breakdown of the way he responds to certain things. And I remember them saying that silence is better than dragging on like an or a word or something like that. So part of me is trying to mentally do that so that it's not sounding too repeated or too awkward. But at the same time, I then get absorbed by my own thoughts and then get lost. So the silence is not helping me keep on track. But hey, this is the first time that I'm trying this, so hopefully it gets better along the way. Because I'd prefer to stop doing that and choose silence over choosing filler words. But anyway, thank you so much again for joining me and catching this episode of the podcast. If you've been watching till the end of the episode, hit me up on Instagram or on Twitter and let me know that you've been watching. I'd love to give you a shout out and just thank you for being a part of this journey, because it's people like you that make this possible, in terms of sharing stories and sort of understanding all the intricacies involved in all of these stories and hopefully breaking boundaries through them. So thank you so much once again for joining me. Make sure to check the description box below for the multiple sources of information that I've mentioned throughout this episode. And make sure to also mention some things in the comment section, some things that you found relatable, some things that you found intriguing, some things that you probably disagreed with, or some things that you agreed with. Feel free to share it all in the comments down below or mention it on the Instagram post for those of you listening to this in audio form. And sort of let me know what you thought about all of this. And let me know if you like this format. And make sure to like this video, share it around, and subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to never miss another episode. Thank you once again for listening and watching. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and don't forget to keep your mind open to different perspectives. Because you never know, random relatability might just be around the corner. And my stomach agrees, because it just growled. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Take care.